It's not easy to find out what you're doing wrong in League. It's even harder to ask a Challenger Pro to figure it out for you. Well, from today, if you're a member of skillcapped, that all changes. We've teamed up with some of the world's best Challenger Pros to bring you a brand new system that we're calling Direct Pro. With Direct Pro, a top Challenger player will handpick and analyze one of your replays to pinpoint your biggest weaknesses and give you real, proven solutions in a custom video created exclusively for you, usually within 3 to 5 hours. But don't worry, you'll be alerted the second your Direct Pro response has been submitted, allowing you to watch it right away. And just in case you're wondering what a Direct Pro response looks like, here's a quick snippet.
Use this wave to push this in, get a cheater recall where on the third wave you recall and buy items and walk back to lane, and then you'll have an item advantage, so not only will you be winning lane, but you're not throwing the game while your team is making a play bot side.
So if you're ready to get involved with our Direct Pro system, head on over to skillcapped.com and sign up today.
Hey everyone, so we all know that good warding is a huge deal when you're playing support. The game just feels different when the support on your team doesn't know what they're doing and the map is dark. Vision is the foundation that your team uses to make plays, so getting it right is very important. In order to solve this vision problem, we need to address how you should ward in the early stages of the game. I'll break down 3 crucial points of the early game that require you to ward correctly to help your team succeed. In this video, we'll not only go over the good warding spots, but the reasons behind why the standard wards are so efficient. On top of that, we'll have to address the differences between red side and blue side every step of the way, and as a reward for sticking with me, I'll show you guys all of the little tips and tricks I've learned over the years to help you get to the next level. For the sake of organization, I'm going to split the video into 3 distinct sections like I mentioned earlier. Hopefully it will make it easier for you guys to digest the information and be able to think about this while in your games. We'll start off with the first phase, which is all about where you should place your first trinket ward in the early game. Then we'll transition into the second phase, which focuses on where you should ward after your first recall, and that brings us to phase 3, what to do once you finally finish your Sightstone quest. So let's get right into phase 1. This phase is almost entirely dependent on what the enemy jungler is, but that's not the only factor as your lane matchup also matters. But before we get into why, let's go over the most standard early ward that you can place. This shallow spot in the river is the most efficient ward you can place at the beginning of the game for bot lane. Funnily enough, the ward is great regardless of what side you're on, as it gives an early warning when you're about to be ganked on either blue or red side from the most likely gank path at 2 different times in the early game. I highly recommend waiting till around 125 or 130 to place the ward, or even as you walk to lane after leashing. The reason why you wait so long is because early trinkets last for about 90 seconds, and this means if you place the ward at 130, it will last until 3 minutes into the game, and by that point junglers are already level 3 and preparing to gank a lane. Before I explain any further, it's always good to place this ward no matter what. Try your best to think about why you want to place it, but if you're ever uncertain about it, it's much better to be safe than sorry. Now that we know this, we can get into a bit of the finer details about when you should and shouldn't want to place this ward. As we know, placing the ward should be your default action, however there will be good reasons not to place it. Can you think of any? Well, the most important reason, which I've already mentioned, is the enemy jungler. If they're playing a more farming-oriented champion like Karthus, Shyvana, Master Yi, and plenty of others, they will likely not gank within the first 3 minutes of the game, so the ward would end up not seeing anything and be generally worthless. Obviously, we can't say for certain that they would never gank, especially in solo queue. We really don't know what these psychopath players will do, but we can make an educated guess that most people will tend to make the more efficient decisions for their champions. This scenario will also happen more and more often with the jungle changes in patch 10.8. Farming the jungle gives more experience, and kills from ganking in the early game give less experience, so make sure to be on the lookout for these farming playstyle junglers, and don't waste your ward here if you don't have to. With that being said, this playstyle is generally not super fun, and in solo queue we all know that junglers won't stop picking champs like Lee Sin, Rek'Sai, and J4 just because they probably don't even read the patch notes. I tend to categorize junglers into 3 different groups. The farming ones like I mentioned earlier, the level 2 gankers, and all the rest that generally need level 3 before they become a real gank threat. This ward is 100% necessary against level 2 gankers like J4, Pantheon, or Xin Zhao, because it will notify you of a potential level 2 gank, but also see a potential level 3 gank as well. Like I said before, the ward lasts until about 3 minutes, and by that time a jungler can easily do 3 camps to hit level 3 and gank bot, so this ward is doubly efficient against those level 2 ganker type champions. Aside from those, the general jungle pool typically wants to hit level 3 before their ganks are really effective. These junglers include Elise, Rek'Sai, Sejuani, and plenty of others. The sword isn't quite as effective against those types as they typically don't attempt level 2 ganks, but sometimes they do, and it really sucks if you're not prepared. So we place the ward for these junglers as well just because it spots the level 3 gank, and it also helps if they happen to lose their mind and level 2 gank us. Alright, so we know the enemy jungler is the biggest factor for whether we want to place this ward. The other thing we need to consider is our bot lane matchup. If the enemy support is playing an engager with heavy CC like Alistar, Nautilus, Thresh, and plenty of others, then there is always a possibility the enemy jungler will come bot. These engager champions just attract junglers, so in the event that they have heavy CC to set up ganks, warding is just the better option. So let's try and think of a bot and jungle combination that we could be certain wouldn't gank us early. My answer would probably be something like Ezreal Yuumi bot lane with a Shyvana jungle, which is funny to me because all of these champions are actually quite popular right now, and it wouldn't be unusual to actually see this combination in a real game. Don't be discouraged if we had different answers. After all, almost any enchanter support and farming jungle combination is a pretty good answer here. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we can think of a combination that would have an insane likelihood of being ganked. My answer would probably be something like Nautilus Kalista bot lane with a Pantheon jungle. My reasoning is that both Pantheon and Nautilus have point-and-click CCs that are mostly unavoidable, and Kalista just has so much mobility and damage to run someone down. Playing against something like this would be pretty unbearable honestly, and you guys hopefully can see the huge difference that the champion picks make. With this second combination, it'd be foolish not to place an early ward, but against the first combination, the ward would be a complete waste. I'm sure you can tell what I'm getting at here. If there's even the slightest chance you could get ganked, just place the ward. But the best part is that there's really not much of a downside if you do place it. In the very early game, there aren't many alternatives that are better. If you saved the ward, it could always be used in a lane bush to help alleviate some lane pressure and make your lane slightly easier to play, or you could hold it entirely for a higher value ward. Either way, bot lane is pretty unique since there are 2 laners, you have 2 trinkets to work with, so using one to ensure your safety early game is never a bad thing. Back to the higher value wards I mentioned, for each side it's different, so let's start with blue side. As the blue side, if you hold your ward, you can save it until you shove a wave into the enemy tower. This often happens on the 2nd or 3rd minion waves. What you want to do is walk into the enemy jungle and place a ward that sees both the Gromp and blue buff area. Wards that see enemy jungle camps are usually pretty valuable because they will almost always spot the enemy jungler, and that's valuable info for your team. On red side, you can wait for the same opportunity and you can ward one of 2 different places, either the tribush or the enemy Krug camp. These wards aren't quite as good as the blue side one, but they're the best options you've got. To decide between the 2, you generally will want to place it in the tribush as it covers multiple paths for the enemy jungler to gank your lane and grants you more general safety. On the other hand, you can place the ward on the Krugs if you feel like you're safe enough from ganks or if the enemy jungler is one of the more farm-oriented champions we mentioned earlier. As you might have noticed, there really aren't great ward options if you're the bot lane being pushed in. This is something we mention a lot at skillcapped, but it's just another reason why having lane priority is so good. Now that phase 1 is out of the way, let's get into phase 2. What should you do after your first recall? Well, there is one specific part of the map that a good support will always try to get control of, and that is in the dot bush next to mid lane. Regardless of blue or red side, your default pink ward placement should always be in that bush. The reason for this ward is that it just sees everything. It covers the entrances to both sides of the jungle, helps your mid laner to avoid ganks, spots out roams from the enemy mid laner, and will often spot the enemy jungler and support if they roam around bot side. This area decides which team has control of the river, and it's definitely worth prioritizing. So honestly, this phase is pretty straightforward compared to phase 1, but there are still things to stay on the lookout for and a couple of interesting variations depending on the situation. Most importantly, you need to be careful when walking into and warding this area. Oftentimes the enemy jungle and support will be nearby or even camping the bush to kill whoever walks by. Try to spot the enemy jungle or support on the map, or use an ability to face check the bush before blindly walking in. On top of this, it never hurts to have your own jungler back you up in this area if you think it's necessary. For blue side, the slight variations you can make depend on how far ahead or behind you are. If your team is behind to the point that it's just not a good idea to go into the river, then you can pink ward the bush behind red buff to keep your jungle entrance safe. Or if you want to be much more selfish in your own lane, then you can pink your own tribush to make sure no roams can come from behind. But if you're ahead on blue side, there are a couple of interesting ward spots past the river that often go unnoticed by the enemy team that still get you a lot of info. These two bushes fly under people's radar quite often, but are still in positions to see both jungle entrances. Deciding between the two, you can go for the one near Gromp if you're playing more selfishly for lane, or the one near Wolves if you want to help the rest of your team, as it's more likely to spot the enemy jungler as he does his camps. For the red side, it's a similar situation. If you're behind, you want to ward these areas, as they protect your jungle entrances from being invaded, and are less likely to be spotted than the river dot bush. The one near Gromp is actually really nice, as it serves as an early warning signal if you're going to be dove by the enemy jungle or mid. But if you're ahead on red side, it can get a bit more fun. I personally prefer these two spots for pinks, as the bush under Krugs is actually one that people will miss a lot, and it can spot the enemy jungler coming to your lane from a mile away. Also, the one past the red buff is a classic deep ward that can stay in the bush forever and spot the enemy jungler every time they walk bot side. That's it for phase 2, so let's get on to phase 3. Where should you place your 3 wards right after you finish your support item quest? Well, the answer to that heavily depends on the game state, which side of the map you're on, and plenty of other factors. So to simplify it, let's start with blue side and assume that it's around 10 minutes and the laning phase hasn't ended yet. I'd place my wards in these positions if my team was even or ahead. If you have wards in these spots, you cover both jungle entrances with wards that don't get swept super often, and you can get a super early warning if the enemy jungler is bot side, as the wards are fairly shoved into their jungle. On top of that, I'd make sure to keep a ward in the middle of river to keep an eye on dragon and make sure no roams from the enemy mid laner go unseen. Obviously, there are some holes in vision with this placement and some redundancies. Unfortunately, you can never have perfect vision, so your goal is to get the most valuable vision you can for your team. These wards get vision on multiple jungle camps, jungle entrances, the dragon, and most of river. On top of this, you have to consider where you and your team have left pink wards already and adjust based on that. We won't go over warding if you're behind in phase 3 since we've already mentioned the goal in phase 2. You basically just want to keep your jungle entrances warded to see if you're getting invaded on the bot side or dove under your tower. At the end of the day, aggressive, proactive vision is much more difficult to get a grasp of than reactive vision anyways. From red side, the vision game is much more fun because there are really tricky spots to get your wards in so that you can avoid enemy pinks and still see everything. These are my favorite spots in the game because the enemy team will very often place pink wards in these bushes, just like we went over in phase 2. If you place these 3 green wards, then none of them will be seen by standard pinks, and you will still see every jungle entrance and know if the enemy jungler ever tries to do dragon due to the ward behind the pit. Another reason this setup is my personal favorite is because it gives the enemy team a false sense of security. They assume that since they have their standard pink wards down that they've denied all the vision, but I can't tell you the amount of times I've avoided jungle ganks and mid lane roams due to these wards. And if you thought it couldn't get any better, these wards are relatively safe to get since all of them are fairly shallow within the enemy jungle, so you don't have to overextend to get them. And that is it guys, everything you need to know about warding in the early game and why. As a fun recap, I want to review one of my own Challenger solo queue games to see how well I followed my own advice. For phase 1, I didn't actually place the ward that I recommend at level 1. I might be biased, but I think it was the right decision because the enemy jungler is Eve, who has no chance of level 2 ganking and tends to farm until 6. On top of that, the enemy support is Yuumi, so in this particular game, I felt totally not threatened by their bot lane and jungle combo. So since I saved my ward, I was able to get the deep ward I mentioned after shoving in the 3rd wave bot lane. Once I placed it, we saw that Eve had farmed both camps. That might initially seem like a letdown, but this lack of information can help us imply that the Eve is most likely pathing topside, and will be back to farm her bot side camps at around the 4.5 minute mark. And just as luck would have it, a few seconds later the Eve shows up in the top side of the map, just as we predicted with our ward. For phase 2, I ended up doing something a bit different. I pathed towards mid on the way to placing a pink in the dot bush, and I was even accompanied by my jungler. But I didn't place the pink ward. Well, instead of placing the standard ward, I had a plan to use this pink in a much more aggressive way to get some kills. I noticed that the enemy bot lane was slow pushing towards our tower because they messed up their wave control. Knowing that MF had no flash, I wanted to sit in the river bush with my Gragas and ambush them for a quick double kill if they face checked us. Unfortunately, an old trinket that they placed much earlier barely spotted out the play. So I didn't quite follow the standard ward mission, but that's okay. If you see something and have an idea, you should go for it. Being able to adapt a plan is necessary to winning in League, and I hope this shows that you shouldn't blindly follow my advice, but use it as a baseline to start thinking for yourself, just like I did here. And last but not least is phase 3. With my little bit of free time in the river, I ended up warding these 2 spots using a pink ward and the bot lane river bush. This isn't exactly what I have laid out in phase 3, but there are good reasons why. For one, I'm playing against an Eve jungle, and she's unique in that wards aren't effective unless you place them directly on her jungle camps. On top of that, I was working with limited time. I only placed these wards because I was trying to flank the enemy MF to dive her, and these wards were the best spots available. If I had infinite time, the best spots would be to ward directly onto her wolf camp alongside the ward that I got on her Gromp and blue buff instead of the one in the river. With that said, the wards I placed were all still very effective against Eve, and I was able to make an interesting play in the process. In any case, this example should further show you guys that you shouldn't just blindly place wards that I'm showing you. Everything in this video is very standard and will be effective most of the time, but over time you'll learn to adapt and improve upon what this guide shows you based on the context of each game you play. Alright guys, that's gonna bring us to the end of the video. We hope you enjoyed and thanks for watching.